Well, on the subject of this week's events, the political scientist Sana Cagaptay writes Erdogan aims to end the mayor's political career, but does he not worry about global pushback? No, Erdogan, he says, is a keen zeitgeist reader. Well, Sana is a senior fellow with the Washington Institute, and he joins us now live from Washington. It's good to have you, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
What do you mean by Erdogan is a zeitgeist reader? Explain.
Absolutely. I mean that President Erdogan is going to leverage the global community's view of Turkey's role in international politics to his advantage. In the last decade, Turkey has emerged as a swing state, a middle power, capable with a lot of military hardware that plays Russia, Europe, and US against each other. These three powers all need Turkey, whether it is stabilizing post-war Ukraine, to stabilizing Syria, preventing refugee flows from there. So I do not expect any of these powers to pick a fight with Erdogan over this issue, and I think he'll be spared a major criticism. There'll be no pushback, no uninvites to summits, no sanctions, nothing meaningful. So Erdogan, as far as the global community is concerned, is free to do whatever he likes at home right now.
And that is fascinating, given your insight there, given that we've seen very little pushback in terms of statements or criticism, apart from, and let me just bring this up, Germany's Chancellor posting the following: the arrest of Istanbul's mayor is a depressing event for Turkish democracy and for our relationship. This is an outgoing European leader, of course, and I wonder whether that is appropriate to the situation happening in Turkey. What's your sense?
I think that Turkey is at an inflection point. Analysts, myself, have described the country's political system in the last decade or half a decade as competitive authoritarianism. If Erdogan gets to pick his opponent, if he gets to jail Istanbul's popular mayor, if he gets to pick his opponent and jail Istanbul's popular mayor, who is the only politician in the country who can defeat him, that means Turkish politics is no more competitive. It becomes simply authoritarian, and I think that's an inflection point. Now, with the outgoing German chancellor commenting, I think there's only one factor here that will make a difference. There's only one thing about Turkey's politics over which Erdogan has no control, which is the markets. Turkey is a resource-poor country. It needs financial inflows to grow again, and Turkey has been suffering from high inflation. And I think that at this point, if markets decide that Turkey is like Belarus, it is junk grade, that's the only factor that might force Erdogan to course correct.
Europe is in a tight spot in relation to Erdogan. The EU needs to rearm for the Trump era. Turkey has a booming defense industry. Europe needs to consider boots on the ground in Ukraine, and Turkey has a 350,000 strong army, and you argue that is likely why there is very little pushback at this point. What about in terms of the United States, who in the past would have led the defense of democracy, at least rhetorically? Here's the State Department spokeswoman this week answering a very specific question.
We would encourage Turkey to respect human rights, to handle its own internal framework appropriately. But we're not going to comment on the decision-making, the internal decision-making of another country, but except to remind them that we expect them to behave in a manner that respects the rights of all of its citizens. And I think that's pretty obvious, but it's good to repeat.
Administration. That is the Trump administration. What do you make of that?
So President Erdogan and President Trump have excellent chemistry. It was reported that they recently spoke, and President Trump might have invited Erdogan to Washington in April. I think that visit, if it was discussed, will go forward. I do not expect any uninvites. I think that the engagement will continue. But beyond the personal chemistry between the two principals, the United States needs Turkey in the global great power competition, as does Europe. Europe is now constituting what could be called NATO in Europe, and that cannot have legs unless Turkey, which is a significant military power, is part of it. So I think, Becky, at this stage, the constraints on Erdogan are more domestic. You have protests, but also a lot of citizens fear that because of state capture by President Erdogan in the last decade, as a result of which Turkey has no independent institutions, very few independent courts and media outlets, which are actually counting their days as independent entities. Citizens fear that if they stand up against this arrest, they protest, they tweet, they'll be jailed, rightly so. So maybe these peaceful protests will overwhelm President Erdogan. It's hard to predict how these protests go. Recently, President of Serbia had to stand down because of these protests. Maybe not. But I would say at this stage, Mayor Imamoglu's greatest strength is Imamoglu himself, which is why President Erdogan went for the nuclear option by jailing him. Erdogan wants to end his political career. That is because Imamoglu has a lot of Erdogan's qualities, but more. Like Erdogan, he's conservative and nationalist, checks those boxes. But he's also a social democrat politician, and he has a wider base than does Erdogan. Erdogan's voters are all right-wing. Imamoglu's voters are on the right, on the left, and on the center. And Erdogan knows that if he's let to run, Imamoglu that is, he'll be defeated by him, and therefore he's decided to go for the nuclear option. But if Imamoglu can keep his brand alive in jail, many politicians have won elections from jail cell, including Nelson Mandela, he could make a comeback.
Right. Solomon, it's good to get your perspective, sir. It is a perspective definitely worth hearing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.